Hello again. Most of us know very well that Britain's National Health Service is on its knees and fast approaching the point of complete collapse. We argue about the reasons for this, of course, but nobody at all denies that it is so. Left-wing people claim that 14 years of Tory cuts have destroyed the NHS, while those on the right wing often blame immigration. There is a deeper problem, though, than either of those things, and it is something common to all huge and unwieldy nationalised industries. Once they reach a certain size and age, such organisations gradually come to be run for the benefit of those working for them, rather than the people whom they supposedly serve. To shut down any such thoughts, we are regularly presented with a terrifying alternative to the present system. This is designed to frighten us and stop us asking too many questions or raising any objections to this or that arrangement with the National Health Service. It can be summarised by asking people if they would rather we had a system like that in the United States, where people are bankrupted by medical bills and cannot afford to see a doctor or visit a hospital. Is that what you want? Because that's what you'll get if you tinker with our beloved National Health Service. The spectre of privatisation is also routinely summoned up to discourage any debates about other and possibly better ways of running the health service in this country. A better question to ask when discussing the shortcomings of the National Health Service is not how things might possibly work in America, but rather how they used to work in this country before the government nationalised the health service. Here's a simple question. What do viewers think was the situation in 1947, the year before the National Health Service began? What happened, say, if a child was short-sighted and needed glasses? Or what if a deaf child needed a hearing aid? What about dental treatment for kids? Did parents have to pay for all these services before the founding of the NHS? They did not, of course. These were provided by the School Health Service, which was not taken over by the NHS until 1974. All such treatment was free and provided for all children in the country by local authorities. This was a pretty good arrangement because instead of a national service, it was a local one, funded by the rates and targeted at the needs of local communities. Each local authority had a medical officer of health. Anyone remember them? This was a person who decided what was needed for children in the local area and who knew far better than some civil servant in London what services were necessary for children in their area. Any viewers who were at school in the 1960s will probably remember this system and know very well that dental inspections at school were routine, as were eye tests, hearing tests, checking for flat feet and a whole lot of other things besides. All completely free for the children and funded locally. As I say, this excellent system of local health services was not taken over by the state until 1974. It was running before the NHS, and it continued to work very well for a quarter of a century after the National Health Service began. I wonder how many people knew this. I rather suspect that most people will be surprised to hear about it. A perfect instance of how free health care can be provided locally rather than nationally. But what about doctors, though? Surely poor people couldn't afford to see a general practitioner before 1948. Didn't doctors charge for their services until the National Health Service came along and made it all free? This too is, of course, a lot of nonsense. National insurance was brought in not in 1948 but in 1911 under Lloyd George, and that is to say 3 years before the start of the First World War. Older viewers might remember when drawing Social Security was known as being on the Lloyd George. Workers had money deducted from their wages to pay for medical treatment should they fall ill, and almost every working person was registered with a GP. The services of the family doctor were free long before 1948. Tell me, does anybody watching this really believe that there was no health service before it was all nationalised in 1948? What about hospitals then? Surely poor people couldn't afford to visit hospitals until the NHS was started. There were no free casualty departments, what we now call A&E, were there? Of course, this too is a lot of nonsense. Just to illustrate the point, I give a link in the description to this video to a brief history of King George Hospital in Ilford, which used to be up by Newbury Park Tube Station. Reading of the services which this hospital was providing in the 1920s and 1930s is a real eye-opener for those who have been brainwashed into thinking that there was no free medical treatment before the NHS. Hospitals of this kind were run locally, again under the local authority. It's quite true that they had some private rooms and that those who were better off preferred to pay for the privacy rather than being on a large public ward, but of course those fees paid for the public wards, at least in part. Partly the rates levied by the local authority, what we now call council tax, paid for the hospitals. Part of the money came from the fees paid by private patients, and of course charities were heavily involved in the running of hospitals too at that time. It was a perfect arrangement. Private patients in effect subsidised the public wards and the free treatment that everybody else got. Those who could not afford medical treatment, that is. Nobody was ever turned away from hospitals because they couldn't afford treatment. This is a scare story which has been circulated by the NHS. Most of the hospitals we use now, for which we are supposed to be grateful to the NHS, were built before 1948, and they were operating well and free to use for people who couldn't afford to pay for their care throughout the 20s and 30s. The area of North London served now by the North Middlesex Hospital in Edmonton was similarly served before 1948, and the service was similarly free. The same thing goes for Whipps Cross in East London. In the years following the end of the Second World War, the new Labour government had a mania for nationalising everything from railways and mines to the health service. There was not really a need to nationalise the health service. It was undertaken for ideological reasons as part of a socialist endeavour. And since then, we have been stuck with this wasteful and inefficient system, and nobody dares to talk about it, let alone challenge it or try and alter it.